All right, so we've been talking about this second wave of feminism and all the progress that brought, and today we're going to wrap that up and then talk about the third wave and how it differs so much from the previous waves. So, if you remember, the 1970s and 60s were packed with action and progress and, protests and legal change and Supreme Court cases and all this stuff for women. The 1980s definitely saw a slowdown of all of that progress, though. The 80s was a time of a big conservative resurgence, and so all of these major social movements are definitely going to see themselves hitting a big obstacle when it gets to the 1980s, and there wasn't nearly as much support in the 80s for this social change as there had been previously. And in the 1980s, feminists will face an issue that they can't agree on, and it really begins to fracture the movement. Ultimately, we consider that to lead to the end of the second wave, and that issue is known as the feminist sex wars. And the issue is actually about porn and women in porn. Basically, the movement couldn't decide what their stance should be on pornography and how it depicts women and how it affects women. On one side, there were people who were saying that it was bad for women, that it glorified the degradation of women, and that it contributed to sex trafficking and forced prostitution and all of these other things. But then there was the other side of the movement that was saying, like, no, pornography encourages women to take control of their own sexuality, and it glorifies the female body, and it empowers women, and if a woman wants to do that, that's her prerogative. So ultimately, when we get into those issues in the 1980s, on top of the fact that we've just lost the ERA, which was a big blow to the movement, and then there's so much less support, everything sort of begins to fizzle out in the 1980s. So we don't see a whole lot of progress and change. It's almost sort of like we took a decade off. But when we get into the 1990s, we'll see the rise of a new wave of feminism that we know as the third wave. If you didn't know, we even had a third wave because we're currently in the fourth wave of feminism. That's because that's sort of what the third wave was about. It was, and I'll get to that in just a second, but it was very different from these other waves. The main goals and issues of the third wave would be violence against women, reproductive rights, reclaiming derogatory terms was a big one, sexual liberation, and inclusivity. So as far as violence against women goes, we know that was a discussion that started to come up in the second wave, but there wasn't any real, change brought as far as that goes, about in stopping violence against women or trying to prevent violence against women. That wasn't really addressed. So we'll start to see groups have more of those discussions, and whether that is physical violence against women or verbal violence against women. We're also going to be having more conversations of sexual assault. Remember, this is the decade of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, right? And Bill Clinton. And so, probably the most famous case, and one of the things that we would consider to be the kicking off of this new third wave, is the Anita Hill case. So, Anita Hill was a woman who worked for the EEOC, if you remember, which was formed under the New Civil Rights Act, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they handled and investigated allegations of whether it be racism, sexual harassment, anything like that in the workplace. You would file your case with the EEOC, and the chairman of the EEOC at the time when she was working for them, back in like the 1980s, was Clarence Thomas, who was a lawyer. And eventually Clarence Thomas went on to be a judge, and in 1991 he was nominated to be a member of the Supreme Court by George Herbert Walker Bush. Bush Sr. nominated Clarence Thomas, and that's him up there in that top picture. So when Clarence Thomas was nominated, they do this huge background check. Like, the FBI does this major investigation into your background, and they hold all these hearings, these confirmation hearings. The president only nominates you. Congress has to confirm you as a member of the Supreme Court. And so when they do this, they call in people that you've worked with and people that you know, to question your character and your beliefs and all, and your, impartiality and all of these other things. And when Clarence Thomas was nominated in that investigation, several sexual harassment claims came up from multiple women. And so they started contacting these women, and one of the women that they contacted was Anita Hill, and she did agree to come forward, and she was basically the only woman who agreed. She didn't really agree to be named. Her name got leaked. But once her name got leaked, she did agree to come in person in front of the Senate and testify, and talk about her experience working with Clarence Thomas. And this was a huge deal. These televised, remember, this is all happening on TV. And so Anita Hill came to D.C. and testified about the things that Clarence Thomas had said to her. And a lot of it revolved around him talking about pornography and describing like sexually explicit things that he had watched. He would talk about the size of his own penis to her. He would talk about women with large breasts. One of the very more famous instances that the media certainly latched onto was a situation in which he was like loudly announcing to his office that someone had left a pubic hair on his Coke can. That was something that was really, everyone, when she talked about that, everyone was like, wow. And when you watch back a lot of these hearings, you really see how far and also how not far we've come in how we treat victims of sexual assault or sexual harassment. The questions from both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, were definitely a lot of victim blaming and a lot of forcing. She had already given her written testimony, so a lot of the questions that they asked were unnecessary because they could just look in her written testimony, and she didn't necessarily have to re-verbalize all of these things. But they asked her those questions anyway, and they wanted to hear them regardless. And it really, and of course, there was a huge backlash from a lot of different groups. There were people who were saying, she was making it up to get attention, which is not true, obviously, because really, as most women who experience something like this find out, something like this can ruin your life. The negative backlash that you can get from coming forward and naming a powerful man as your abuser can ruin your job, your career. You can lose friends and family members. So that certainly wasn't a big motivator for this. So she was already had a great career, why jeopardize it? But she felt that it was the right thing to do. And to be honest, because she didn't feel like we needed someone who was like that sitting on our Supreme Court. Other than that, there are plenty of people who are like, oh, she's just trying to attack a black man. She must be being paid by the other side of the aisle to like prevent a black man from being getting this powerful position. And that just shows the issues within the civil rights movement, how black women are still, even among the black community, not always given the benefit of the doubt, not believed, not taken seriously, and expected to just or are seen as liars or deceivers and things like that. So ultimately, Clarence Thomas was confirmed as a Supreme Court judge, and he currently sits on the bench today. Anita Hill went on with her life. She's now, a professor at a prominent college, and she went on to do her thing. But this definitely, like I said, sparks a lot of those conversations, and so we'll start to see a lot of change happen really quickly. Other groups that were talking about violence against women was a group called the Riot Girls, and you can see how it's spelled on the slide. Girl, not traditionally spelled the same way. No I, 3 R's. And this was actually a feminist punk subculture growing out of Washington State, which was like about music and stuff. And they were using the punk subculture that already existed in Washington and trying to put this sort of like feminist stamp on it. And they talked about issues like rape and the patriarchy and sexuality and other things like that. And so we will see some progress in this area. In 1994, Congress does pass the Violence Against Women Act, which institutes like a couple $2 billion for prevention of violence against women, resources for victims of violence, and tools to investigate cases of violence against women. Like I said, whether it be verbal, domestic, sexual violence, whatever it may be, the Violence Against Women Act definitely helps with that. But it doesn't, end all problems. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. And we'll see the fourth wave of feminism when it comes in the mid 2000s. That's when we're going to see the violence against women really being like the one and only goal of that wave of feminism. Like I said, reproductive rights is also going to be a big one. We know that Roe v. Wade was passed in the early 70s, but that was just one step. There were plenty of states that were trying to limit women's access to birth control, so that was certainly one of the things that women wanted to fix. And in 1993, they passed FMLA, the Family and Medical Leave Act, which it basically guaranteed your opportunity to, if you need to take medical leave for your family, then you can do that, whether it be that you have a sick child or husband and you need to take FMLA to take care of them, or you get pregnant. This basically guarantees maternity leave regardless of your job. Now, you do have to file for FMLA, and it can definitely be not approved. I know some people that's happened to, so it's not a perfect system, but it's definitely a positive step. Like I said, the other main issue that they were working for was reclaiming derogatory terms, especially the term bitch. And that's one of the reasons why girl is spelled like that, is the Riot Girls were trying to reclaim the word girl. So they decided to spell it differently. But bitch was a big one, and this was about reclaiming that word that had been used for so long to degrade women, whether it be powerful women or women who try to assert their own independence. So there was a lot of music, a lot of female written and sung music to come out in the 90s that uses that word in a more powerful way, trying to reclaim this, similar to the way that the Chicano movement reclaimed the word Chicano, or the way that some African Americans have tried to, or successfully reclaimed the N-word. It just depends on the movement and how you view it. But that's what the third wave, one of the things that the third wave was trying to do. They definitely were talking a lot about sexual liberation and owning your own body. One of the major movements of the third wave was actually a play called the Vagina Monologues, which was on Off-Broadway in 1996, written by a woman named Eve Ensler. And it was a series of monologues. Originally, Eve performed all of the monologues herself, but after time went on, and it blew up and got tons of attention, she started getting other actors to do some of these monologues. And they were about everything from rape, abortion, marriage, menstruation, all of these different issues that affect women, women's bodies, all sorts of things like that. And it became very, very popular. So popular that it gave Eve Ensler the platform to start her own organization called V-Day, which still exists, and it's an organization devoted to preventing and stopping violence against women and giving women those resources. And then the last major goal of the movement is inclusivity and encouraging all types of women, regardless of whether it be cis women or trans women, whether it be white women or women of color, middle class, lower class, doesn't matter. And that was one of the big criticisms of the second wave of feminism, is that it was definitely like middle class white women's feminism, definitely middle class cisgendered straight white women's feminism. And so we didn't see a lot of progress for other marginalized groups within the female community. And so the third wave was certainly about trying to include more of those groups. It certainly wasn't perfect. We don't see all of the racial inclusivity that they had hoped for, but it certainly was a step in the right direction. A few other things worth noting. In 1991, Congress will open combat positions in the military to women for the first time. And in 1993, they're going to start the Take Your Daughter to Work Day. I'm sure you've heard of like Take Your Kid to Work Day, but it actually started as Take Your Daughter to Work Day. And that's because they wanted to take young girls to businesses so they could think about career opportunities and encourage girls to develop their own dreams and aspirations and push for a career of their own. Now, ultimately, the third wave definitely gets plenty of criticism, and the main criticism falls into two categories. The first is that they call it girly feminism and say that this really is responsible for some of the raunch culture of the 1990s. And that's because, like I said, the third wave is really about sexual liberation and reclaiming derogatory terms. Some people called this like lipstick feminism and said that it was encouraging bad behavior, and that and they were like, yeah, exactly, like sexual liberation, like that is what we're encouraging. We want to encourage girls to do whatever they want and like live whatever life that they choose. So while that was a criticism of the movement was like perfectly fine with it. And that's the same with the other area of criticism, which was its lack of cohesion. There was not necessarily one major leader. There are, of course, important figures like Eve Ensler and Anita Hill, but there was not one main leader. We didn't have someone forming an organization to push for, legal change in this capacity. We were missing like a Gloria Steinem or a Betty Friedan of this movement. And so because of that, there are plenty of people who were like, well, that's why it hasn't been super successful. That's why it hasn't gotten a lot of legal change. And that's what the movement wanted. They wanted this lack of cohesion. They wanted it to be a grassroots. They wanted it to have a grassroots element and not necessarily be run by a, corporate board of activists. So eventually by, the early 2000s, we consider this third wave to sort of fizzle out. And then we'll see the new wave begin when we get to around 2008. That's when the fourth wave will start.